Well, greetings fellow dwarfers, welcome back to another one of my episode breakdowns, this week looking at Series 1, Episode 4, Waiting for God. Now this is actually the second time I've done a breakdown of this particular episode, the previous time actually being the first proper Red Dwarf nerd video I ever made. Originally, I broke this episode down in the lead up to the Promised Land being released so that people could get up to speed with the lore of the cat people, as by then we already knew that the Promised Land would be featuring the cats. Feel free to go watch that original breakdown if you like. It's not great, it's very basic, very short, and really only focuses on the elements that were relevant to the Promised Land. But feel free to go watch it and see how far the channel has, or hasn't, progressed. So, Waiting for God. This is a funny one to break down because the writers, Rob Grant and Doug Naylor, don't really like this episode. According to the Season 1 documentary, Rob Grant said that Waiting for God was his least favourite of all the episodes, and Doug Naylor said in the same documentary that whilst the idea of the episode seemed really smart, when they got into it, he found it turgid and difficult. So it's going to be really interesting to dive into this one and see what we think, see what we can find, and try and even identify why it is that the writers might not like it. So let's dive into the episode. We get the usual moody opening, but rather than just a gag, we actually get Holly updating us on what happened in the previous episode, where Lister claimed that he'd passed the engineering exam, but actually Holly reveals here that he'd failed it. But thanks to Norman Lovett's dry humour, this still comes across actually pretty funny and makes a decent gag. We then get to see Rimmer in the drive room talking to Holly, wanting to see the captain's confidential reports. And he starts with Lister's, which sounds fairly bad. Then here's his own, which sounds atrocious. We'll get to hear some of these captain reports again in Season 12, Episode 6, Skipper, but there they were slightly different. This could possibly be because here in Waiting for God, Rimmer just asked for the remarks, and perhaps in Skipper, they're getting more of the full report, or it could just be a different report made by the captain at a different time. Unauthorised use of confidential information would also become a major plot point in Season 8 and be the entire reason that the Dwarfers are in prison. Whilst reading out Lister's report, Holly mentions that Lister left his job as a supermarket trolley attendant that he'd been at for 10 years. This is also mentioned in the novel Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers. There we get a whole section about Lister hating one of his old bosses that chastised him one time for sleeping on the job, and how Lister dreaded ending up becoming just like his boss. Also in the episode Future Echoes, Lister mentioned being 25, so if he worked for 10 years in a supermarket immediately before the JMC, he must have been working from the age of 15. So either he blagged his way into that job underage, or perhaps in the future, you're going to be working young. An unidentified object, or UO, appears on Holly's scans, but Rimmer isn't interested because he's still busy sulking about his report. We then see Lister in the bunk room reading or smelling a cat book whilst wearing one of Rimmer's shirts and talking to the toaster. Unlike in Future Echoes, the toaster here is more persistent about Lister eating toast, a bit similar to how it will be when rebuilt in White Hole. Originally, this would have been the first appearance of the toaster, voiced by John Lenihan, before the order of episodes got shuffled around a little and Future Echoes was moved up to second place. It's cool to see that this toaster has the same voice unit light on the side of it as the vending machines, making a nice sort of technological continuity in this show. And I mentioned this last time I broke down this episode, and I'm going to mention it again. Lister wearing Rimmer's shirt means that he's seemingly elevating himself one command point, as the badges on his chest now represent him as a second technician, not a third. This nicely foreshadows the episode's upcoming storyline of Lister being misrepresented as a far more significant being than he really is. Nice bit of foreshadowing. The toaster misquotes Rene Descartes. Instead of, I think therefore I am, it's I toast therefore I am. Nice that the toaster's contemplating the meaning of life in an episode where that discussion is going to be had by Rimmer a few minutes later.
I toast, therefore I am.
Lister, if there's no one out there, what's the point in existence? Why are we here?
Rimmer arrives and sees Lister sniffing books. Lister explains that cat writing is based on smells. We'll later get to see the Cat King Rodin do this in the Promised Land. It's funny that back in Future Echoes, Lister claimed never to have read a book. Well, here at least he has possibly sniffed a full book. The cat arrives through a service duct with another great forward roll like he did in the first episode, and he's got a new suit. As the cat walks, we can see the depth of the set. It's nice also to see a splash of colour for a change. The cat talks to Rimmer about his yo-yo that he's found and plays the string game. We later see the cat playing the string game in Season 10, Episode 8, The Beginning. And in Season 11, Episode 6, Can of Worms, he suggests to the female cat disguised polymorph that they should both play the string game. In the drive room, Holly confirms that the UO is a pod, much to Rimmer's delight. The cat visits Lister in his bunk room and gives him a copy of the Cat Bible, which we'll later see in the Promised Land is called the Book of Smeg. Lister tries to convince the cat that he is the cat's god, Cloyster. After the cat leaves, Lister asks Holly to translate the book using his cat dictionary. So, Holly, somewhere, somehow, must have a sense of smell, or at least some sort of apparatus which can pick up smells. Lister and Rimmer in the observation room check out the pod. Rimmer reveals that it's been 18 weeks since Lister came out of stasis, so that gives us a nice little time frame for this episode. Ignoring Rimmer, Lister flaunts the quarantine rules more freely than a Downing Street partygoer. Lister makes some really funny faces on the glass, taking the mick out of Rimmer pretending to be somehow alien possessed. The creators realised that Craig Charles could do this from having seen him do it on a door in the rehearsal studios and just put it straight in a script. During their conversation, Lister gives the length of service for him and Rimmer. 15 years for Rimmer, 8 months for Lister, which makes Rimmer, having only ever been promoted one position, seem all the more pathetic for 1.5 decades of service. This also helps us to work out the journey times for Red Dwarf's original mission. If we take Lister's 8 months of service and add the 18-month stasis period that he was given, which was the remainder of the trip back to Earth, then that would be 26 months for a one-way journey. So with 26 months being a one-way journey, 52 months would be the full circuit around the solar system. So then, if we take Rimmer's 15 years of service, or 180 months with the JMC, and plot that against 52 months for a round trip, it turns out that despite his huge amount of time in the JMC, he'd have actually only made the round trip 3.46 times before the radiation leak. Anyway, back to the episode. After Rimmer leaves, Lister looks closer and realises that it's a Red Dwarf garbage pod. Holly already knows this and said he didn't tell Rimmer because it's a laugh. Lister questions whether Rimmer ever worked in waste disposal, which is of course why he'd never seen a garbage pod, which also tells us that at some point Lister must have worked there. We then get a ship flyby sequence, which is nothing unusual in itself. We get them in all the episodes. But on this one, a joke is told in voiceover at the same time. Usually there's only music heard during the flybys, as they're just used to remind us that the guy's on a huge ship and to represent the passing of time. But here it's used to tell a joke, which will also be done again at the end of this episode over the closing credits. So it seems like the team were experimenting with different ways of telling gags in this episode. Rimmer doesn't seem to be able to sleep, so wakes Lister up in the middle of the night to tell him about his excitement over the pod. Lister, during the conversation, literally tells Rimmer the truth, that it's garbage. But Rimmer just doesn't get it. We get a really funny talk here about Rimmer imagining that the aliens could be a green-haired woman with 3 breasts. Before Rimmer gives himself away a little bit and says the line, "Imagine making love to a woman," which implies that Rimmer is a virgin. However, in the next episode, Confidence and Paranoia, we'll hear how he slept with Yvonne Magruder. There is a deleted scene available for this part, which expands upon this conversation and gives a lot more of a talk about what each of the guys thinks the meaning of life should be. What we presume is the next morning in the drive room, Lister orders breakfast of chicken vindaloo and a beer milkshake. The beer milkshake will be referenced in the next episode by Lister's confidence. Holly says that he's completed translating the cat dictionary and confirms that Lister is their god Cloyster. Holly explains that the Cat Bible version of heaven was based on Lister's Fiji plan, and the sacred star chart was based on his laundry list. He also tells Dave about there being holy wars, where 2 factions of cats emerged, those who believed that the Donut Diner hat should be blue, and those that believed they should be red. Throughout this conversation, there's various pictures, seemingly from the Cat Bible, to represent this stuff, including one where the 2 factions seem to be fighting each other, but the hat colours seem to be all wrong. The Remastered edition changed all these pictures so that the hats were the correct colours, and so that the pictures of Cloyster looked far more like Craig Charles and even had the little dreadlocks. Which, honestly, of all the remastered changes, these are some of the least offensive. In the book Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, the war wasn't over the hat colour, it was simply over whether Lister was called Cloyster or Clister. Back to the episode, apparently after a truce, the 2 factions flew off on 2 separate arcs in search of Fushal. before one was destroyed. This can only have been very recently, within the cat's lifetime, as in the Promised Land, his older brother talks about having left the cat and all the uncool ones behind. I often wonder what the arcs were actually made of. Did they pinch a few of the Red Dwarf's spare parts? Or did Red Dwarf originally have a couple of large craft on board? Again, in the novel Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers, this has changed slightly. Instead of 2 large arcs, they went off in a fleet of shuttlecraft. Back in the observation room, Rimmer and 2 Scutters are examining the pod, while Lister tries to discuss his personal turmoil over his past actions possibly causing a holy war. Rimmer freaks out and shouts about how much more important the pod work is, and calls his suspected alien pod creators the Quagars, 2 A's. Lister calls it tot and leaves, and Rimmer calls Lister a bastard. He'll later call himself this in Season 8, Episode 1, Back in the Red, Part 1.
The world loves a bastard.
Lister cruises around on his space bike looking for the cat before asking Holly where he might be. Holly says that the cat is no longer within his supervision field, having gone into the cargo bays via supply pipe 28. It seems like Lister stood right next to where the cat might have left, as he immediately can shout into an open vent. We then jump to a very different scene in a very different part of the ship, and are even introduced to a whole nother character. Now this is meant to be down in the cargo bays, and is one of the reasons that Rob Grant was disappointed with the episode, having imagined whilst writing an alien movie-esque huge chamber where the cat priest was. But instead, on screen, the budget and the size of the stage meant that they could only really have what looked like a stockroom filled with cobwebs. And here we are 23 minutes into a 28.5-minute show, and we finally get introduced to a guest character, an old blind cat priest, who Danny John-Jules' cat is talking to, or rather talking at, ignoring everything the priest says. Even when the priest says that he's dying, the self-obsessed cat just wants to go on telling his story. So the cat priest was not mentioned and not even hinted at earlier in this episode. He just appears with no setup, no foreshadowing, not even a hint. The cat priest is played by Noel Coleman, who would later appear in the pilot for The Detectives, which, just like Waiting for God and most of Red Dwarf, was also directed by Ed Bye. Lister enters or falls into supply pipe 28. Apparently doing this, Craig Charles managed to quite badly hurt his leg. The priest begins losing his faith in Cloister and demands that the cat burn his red hat. The style-obsessed cat likes the hat, so doesn't burn it, just puts it on his own head. The hat happens to be red, so the priest is obviously from the red faction of cats. Just outside the room is a few golden symbolic items left there by the cats, and Lister randomly puts a golden donut on his head and enters the room just as the priest despairs that Cloister does not exist. The entrance is very dramatic, with hard, pure white light on the priest and smoke all over the place. Thank goodness Lister brought with him a lighting rig and a dry ice machine. Lister threatens to hit the cat with a symbolic golden hot dog if he doesn't play along, which happens to line up with the sacred writings about Cloister arriving, wearing a donut on his head and holding the golden sausage. The priest says that he spent his life keeping the faith and wore the holy custard stain and the sacred gravy marks, which Lister looks down at his shirt and recognises. Does this mean that Lister's shirt hasn't been washed since before the accident, since a point when Frankenstein would have seen that dirty shirt? Does that mean that in 3 million years and 18 weeks, that shirt still hasn't been washed? Dear me, Lister. The priest explains that the cats left behind the sick and the lame. The cat's parents were a cripple and an idiot, and the priest makes it sound like the Danny John-Jules cat was born after the other cats left behind all the sick and the lame. However, in the Promised Land, when Rodin says they left behind all the uncool ones, it implies that the cat was deliberately left behind, so the other cats couldn't have left until after he was born.
We left all the uncool ones behind. Crazy teeth, mad hair. There was no place for them, so we left them.
Lister forgives the cat priest for losing faith and promises that he'll get a place in Fushal, before giving him back his hat that the cat was wearing. The old priest then dies, and the cat, again self-obsessed, doesn't care at all. He just continues on talking about his investigating feat. The final scene is back in the observation room with the pod. Lister opens it, much to Rimmer's excitement, and reveals a gone-off chicken, which Rimmer first thinks must be the remains of a Quagar warrior, before realising in voiceover during the credits that it's a garbage pod. It's a smegging garbage pod. So there you go, good people. There wasn't a huge amount to say from the books or the remastered edition or even the deleted scenes. I could only really find one. But it's still a really interesting episode to look at. And I personally really like this episode. Mainly for the Quagar story arc, which I think is really, really funny. However, I have to admit I can kind of see why the writers might have issues with this one. Whilst it could work great in a novel or some other long form like a film, in a short 28.5-minute episode, yeah, there was a lot that had to be cut down. The cat priest, for instance, just appears from nowhere, with no setup and no foreshadowing. Also, items like the donut and the golden sausage just appear with no prior hint that they would be sacred to the cats. So I can see why the writers might have been disappointed with how it came across on screen. Also, something that was expanded in the novels was the discovery of the Cat City down on some of the enormous cargo decks. An entire city was down there with huts and houses and streets. Something you couldn't possibly represent in a fairly low budget 28-minute episode, but it shows the scope that the guys wanted to achieve but weren't able to do so. So I can see why the writers might have been disappointed with how things came across in this episode, but as I said, I like this episode and I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts about it. Stick them in the comments below, tell me what you think. And in effect, this episode did get a sequel. 32 years later, The Promised Land, which was almost entirely based on the cat backstory details revealed in this episode. And so without this episode, Waiting for God, there'd be no Promised Land special. And with no Promised Land special, I wouldn't have been inspired to create this channel 18 months ago. So for me, Waiting for God's a really important episode. So guys, thank you so much for watching. It's been an interesting one to break down. The writer's least favourite episode. Interesting, I still like it. As mentioned, let me know down below what you think of this episode and feel free to ask any questions or make any comments you want to make. Just keep it civil down below. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this breakdown, then give us a thumbs up. Hit subscribe if you've not done so and hit the bell icon so you know when the next episode is out. I'm doing these breakdowns all the time, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss one. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time, Smegheads.